phone booth.
Yes.
It took you no time at all to get changed there. Here's one I prepared earlier.
All right. Our
Okay.
live stream is actually live right now. No one's on it quite yet, but they will be. And Gaz, if you're going to give us some music to bring us into the audio.
Okay. I'm going to mute now,
Yes, sir.
so the music will be playing anytime you want to come in. Just come in. I'll reduce the music down.
All right. Well, folks, here we are. It's another Tuesday, and we are together with Dr. Rima Labo and our guest for another Unmasked Crusaders podcast and live stream. Dr. Rima, you are live.
I prefer being live to any of the options. This is Rima Ilebo, MD. I'm the medical director of the Natural Solutions Foundation, and you are listening to and or watching the Dr. Rima Truth Reports. It's about truth, it's about sharing truth, and it's about facing the consequences of telling that truth as widely as we can. We have a special guest today. He's a new friend to me, and I'm very excited to bring him to you. His name is Dan Brock. And before we bring him in, I'd like to tell you about some events that are unfolding. As you know, the FDA is suing me, Counsel Ralph, the Natural Solutions Foundation, basically for telling the truth about research that was conducted for and declassified by the United States government about how useful nanosilver is in the presence of viruses because it keeps them from attaching to, penetrating, or replicating in normal cells. That's pretty useful. And the US government says, thou shalt not say that. And we believe that we have the rights to be able to say what is true and what is useful. And then we also believe that people have the right to do what they like with that information in terms of their own bodies and health and so on. So, this case in the Third Circuit Federal District Court is very important. We will be able to ask questions, and we also have a petition, which Ralph can talk about, before the FDA, a citizen's petition, which says, okay, what can we say about natural silver? What are the claims that you will allow us to make about a nutrient product called nanosilver? And that's a very important citizen's petition, which is not like an ordinary petition of just getting a lot of names and sending it to somebody. It's an administrative process that we have the right to engage in, again, under the First Amendment. Love that First Amendment, especially when it's not ignored. Just love it. I'm hoping that Ralph will give us an update on that case and where you can go to support it. This is Giving Tuesday. We want you to give. We want you to give your time to disseminate this information. We want you to give some money so that we can take this case as far as it needs to go. It's been brought into federal court. Actually, we've been itching to get the FDA into federal court, and they've done us the favor of suing us for telling the truth. Yes. So this is an enormously important case for you and for your health freedom. And it goes far beyond silver. It goes to the right to speak and to be heard and to make decisions based on that speech, that free speech. We want you to give money. We want you to go to nsfmarketplace.com, and we want you to click the support button and give generously for your health freedom and the right to understand and to learn and to know and to use natural options, which of course we are living under governments who oppose. So this is a fabulously important opportunity for all of us. Ralph, would you care to say a little bit about that before we begin our conversation with Dan, and of course about anything else you'd like to say?
Of course. The only question is, how is my audio? And the folks on the live stream, if you can send me a note telling me how the audio is. Dr. Rima, they say your audio is very good. All right, there's one more thing folks can do, and then I'll get into the issues. And that is, they can go to opensourcetruth.com. And if you're watching the live stream, you see it on the top of the screen, opensourcetruth.com. And you'll find a sign-up form right there in the top of the page, basically, an inch or two down, and you can join Dr. Rima's email list. Really important to do that too. Yes, we need your help to fight for your freedom, and that's what's going on. We are being sued. Look, we have acted in good faith from the start. Back in 2014, we uncovered a U.S. government-sponsored study of nanosilver. The agency was the Defense Threat Reduction Agency, the DTRA, and they had a study in which the very same silver that Dr. Rima recommends was tested in vitro, in petri dishes, against a whole slew of dangerous viruses. And in every case, there was virtually no replication of the virus. What that means is that, and these were living cells in these petri dishes, what that means is that the virus cannot attach itself to your living cells, penetrate the cells, and replicate. There is no disease. In fact, there's no prevention of disease because there's no disease in the first place. There's just virus in your environment and in your bloodstream. Our bodies contain literally trillions of viral particles. They're part of our immune system. They help educate our immune system. They help develop what is called community immunity. And it's when those particles in our environment and in our bodies are not disease. They're only disease when the protective process breaks down. But so long as you have a normally functioning immune system, you should not have to worry about infectious diseases. Of course, obviously, there are all sorts of circumstances, and nobody can guarantee that you're not going to be exposed to a disease that for some reason exhibit symptoms. But in a strong immune system, and that's what we've been talking about, a strong immune system is the key to your protection. Nanosilver feeds a strong immune system. That's what we've been talking about. The petition we filed with the FDA asks the FDA to recognize that the scientific studies show that nanosilver reduces the risk of infection from viruses. That's the limit of that claim. There are many other claims one could make about nanosilver, but that's the claim we're asking the government to approve. We already believe that we're allowed to say nanosilver supports normal immune system function. And that's your standard claim that you can make for most any vitamin. But the more specific claim, that it reduces the risk of infection from virus, we believe is well characterized by the studies, not just the Defense Threat Reduction Agency declassified study, was declassified in 2009, but also a study that was just published on PubMed. And we'll be presenting that information to the FDA and to the court, and asking.
And that one was specific to coronavirus, by the way.
Yes.
This is so important. And remember, it's not just about silver. It's about speech. It's about truth. It's about whether saying that something has been studied for some purpose turns it into a drug. That means vitamin C would be turned into a drug by what Linus Pauling did. Pauling died back in 1994. We are talking about the right to control our own bodies through information and through choice. It's that profound. We need your support. Even with the most friendly billing system in the world from our friendly, powerful lawyer allies, this is an expensive process, and we need your support. nsfmarketplace.com has a support button. Use it. Go to Fundly. Ralph, could you read the Fundly site?
Sure. You can go to. I'm getting an echo, folks. Excuse me. Let me lower this volume. Let's see. All right. You can go to Fundly, FUNDLY.com / support natural remedies. Remedies. It's support-natural-remedies. But it's just as easy to go to opensourcetruth.com and you'll find ways of supporting us on Giving Tuesday through that system as well.
Absolutely. There was a question that just came through the chat. Please remind people of the difference between herd immunity and community immunity. And I'm happy to do that. Herd immunity does not exist. It is more rampant nonsense. If you have a herd whose genetics are similar or identical, if you have a herd that moves together and does not go to different places and then come back together, if you have a herd that does not have new members coming in because somebody came from somewhere else, and that herd develops an immune response to a disease, a bacterial disease, a parasitic disease, a viral disease, it was hypothesized that the herd would have herd immunity if 67% of the members of that herd had been exposed to the disease and were now immune. That hypothesis was something that, animal biologists talked about, and they discovered that it did not exist. That number, the 67%, turned out not to work. It was a hypothesis that wound up, like so many do, in the graveyard of discarded scientific ideas. Seemed reasonable, turned out to be wrong. Somehow or other, the deceptive people in the public health world, those who bring us Faucism, for example, took this idea and said, well, it must apply to people. People must have identical genetics. People must live in a herd and never travel away from one another. People must have the same kind of immune reaction to things that animals do, except they don't actually. And the answer is no, that's nonsense. On the other hand, if lots of people are exposed to measles, chickenpox, mumps, coronavirus, also known as the common cold, and lots of them have experienced the virus or the bacterium, two things happen. One, people do in fact develop immune responses. So you only get measles once if you meet it in the community and you have a community exposure. That's it. You're never going to get measles again because your body remembers. The second thing that happens is that the measles virus learns how to live as a commensal, as a co-traveler in your body, and becomes less and less and less of a biological threat until eventually we don't even know that we have it. Now, it happens, measles hasn't quite reached that stage yet because it does produce a rash and a sniffly nose and an itchy, irritable kid for about 3 days, which is not a lethal disease in anybody who's well-nourished and well-hydrated. But we make use of that. When you meet the measles virus in the community, you may get the disease as a kid, you may not. But what happens is if you meet it and you do get the disease, when you're 30 years old, 40 years old, 50 years old, your rate of a whole variety of cancers is very much reduced because the virus tunes your immune system to respond aggressively when it meets cancer cells. And it's a very complicated mechanism. We don't understand all of how that happens, but it does happen. We use viruses. We need viruses. They train us. If you get the measles vaccine, that does not happen. Oh, how interesting. So we're talking about a community-wide phenomenon as opposed to a herd phenomenon. The difference is not just semantic. The definition of herd immunity doesn't apply either to animals or to people. Community immunity is very real, and it's a very important process in taming plagues so that they become just tag-along pathogens, and in raising our immune capacity so we can meet those plagues and not die from or be disabled from the diseases that they might cause. Huge difference. Community immunity is real, important, and something we want. Herd immunity is something that we're told can be developed. First, it was 67% of the population that had to be vaccinated, as if that had anything to do with it. Then it was 80%, then it was 85, then it was 90, then it was 92, then it was 95, then it was 97, and now it's 100. What? If vaccines work, why would unvaccinated people be any threat? That makes no sense at all. That's as illogical as masking. And musicians are now playing performances. I'm going to put these photos up on Open Source Truth. I haven't had a chance yet. They're playing performances with holes in their masks so they can play their saxophones and clarinets and flutes and piccolos and other wind instruments. What? So we're not dealing. Absolutely. Which is why we not only have an advanced sanitary masking directive that says under the Americans with Disability Act, I am exempt from masking because I have a problem with my breathing when I have to wear a mask, which is true, you do. Or we also have a product which is a mask that does not restrict airflow. So for those times when you don't want to fight or it's too quick to just run in and get the groceries that you want and you can't fight with the store manager and so on, we have these masks available at nsfmarketplace.com, which do not restrict airflow, but they allow you to not have to argue idiocy. However, for more substantive issues, you want the advanced sanitary masking card, which is a companion card to the advanced vaccine directive, which says, I refuse all vaccines. Note that word, all. And that is your right under national and international law. Oh, I said I was going to talk about where I've been. I spent all of Sunday and a couple of days in the previous weeks participating as a judge in a tribunal against those who are introducing 5G, aspartame, COVID vaccines, and other genocidal tools. And we will be making the archives of the substantive testimony and documentation for that testimony available. The people there from around the world are a very powerful group of folks, and they've decided to take one of my catchphrases. Remember, I say the 3 most important words that a free person can utter are "don't you dare," and they've created hashtag "don't you dare," and we'll be bringing things forward around the world at hashtag "don't you dare," a website which Ralph just purchased. So we now own don'tyoudare.me. Yeah. Okay. So that was very exciting and very forward moving. I would like now to introduce our guest, unless I have shortcut what you were going to say, Ralph. Did I? Okay. Because, folks, I get so excited, I cut Ralph off. And he's very patient. So I have to circle back and say, were you about to say something? But he wasn't. Okay. Dan Brock is a new friend for Natural Solutions Foundation, and I'm very excited to have him on the show. We have a friend in common, Dan and I, named Standing Bear. And Standing Bear asked us to meet each other. It turns out we both happen to live in the same place, Tucson, Arizona, which I am very pleased to tell you is now cold. I was wearing sweaters and warm clothes over the last couple of days. It was divine. Anyway, um, Dan is a longtime resident of Tucson. He is associated with the University of Arizona, and he has some very, very important perspectives and interests that I think have to do with how we make all of this right. That's pretty important. And that's pretty large. So, Dan, welcome to the Dr. Rima Truth Reports. And please tell us about yourself. Introduce yourself to our folks.
Absolutely. Can both of you hear me?
Perfectly.
Okay,
And
good.
see you.
Well, it is a real pleasure to be here, and I am very appreciative for the opportunity to talk to the community. And let me say, the two of you are such an inspiration. The energy that you guys exude is so powerful and so motivational. It's wonderful. So I'm glad to be here. My history is a little varied. I have a background in critical thinking. I was a nuclear engineer for the Department of Defense. I have a degree in mechanical engineering and was an environmental engineer as well. And I sort of gave that up and went into the film world, did software development for a while. But as an individual, I have focused a lot of my attention on working with others. And I have worked with education has been sort of the calling that I've had, and the filmmaking has been sort of adjunct to that. I am involved with the University of Arizona School of Theater, Film, and Television, and I help the students there in the filmmaking program. But I have a lot of other interests that go beyond just career or what I do in my ordinary working life. The interests that I have go way back in time to a period when I had a lot of experiences early on that led me into a larger understanding of the nature of reality than was conventionally communicated to us, and certainly relates to the issues that we're experiencing right now with the power of the controlling communities, if we want to call them that, on the earth, that are using this pandemic situation as an opportunity to exploit control mechanisms. I see that again and again and again, and I see the continued way in which individuals become very complacent in their belief systems and attach themselves to the belief systems of the institutions that they're connected with, or the organizations, or the government, or any source of information that they have decided is truthful. Whether that source of information represents their independent ability to make a decision on their own and protect their own sovereignty seems to be somewhat sidelined. And this is what I have been working on for a period of time, and looking at the relationship between how we decide what we do and where things are going with our society. There was a term that I came across a number of years ago called an egregore. And an egregore is a term that comes from Greek sources that is used to describe basically a mass thought form. And that is, each time that we engage in, connect to, or create a mass identity where there is something outside of us, we're creating something that you would be akin to a mass thought form. This can have its correlations in everywhere in human society, in religions, in military and government, of course, in institutions, in corporations, in everything, down to the smallest levels. So they're identifiable to be both beneficial and non-beneficial. So one of the things that's very important is to understand, how do the egregores fit into the larger picture of reality? And the consequence of this means we really need to, and I have explored the larger aspects of reality and looked at the importance of embracing a larger understanding of the context in which we exist. a key factor is, and everyone's heard this, I'm sure before, we're spiritual beings having a physical experience. There is a non-physical aspect to who and what we are and everything around us that all of us need to be aware of and maintain a mindfulness that that is a component of our reality and that our reality is composed of that. The unfortunate thing is that humans as physical beings are very manipulatable. We have our perception manipulated constantly through so many different sources. One of the hallmarks of consciousness has been the ability to deceive. And we have to develop our mechanisms of discernment over the course of our life in order to basically sidestep those manipulations of our perception. And the information coming from the non-physical has indicated that there is an enormous amount of manipulation of our perception that happens from that source. And this can be in many regards considered similar to the type of patterns that we have in the physical world, where we have people that are beneficial to us, that are friends, that are family, that are close to us, and we understand them and we appreciate them, and they are here for our benefit. And conversely, we have individuals that we feel threatened by and are not beneficial to us. It's the same thing apparently on the non-physical side. It is possible to become connected to non-beneficial entities and non-beneficial energy or vibrations from the non-physical side. And so in tuning yourself to the presence of egregores and understanding that that exists, embracing this larger concept of reality, we really need to move into a direction where we are making better decisions in that connection and having a connection that allows us to make better decisions. It's sort of a two-way street. Our connection allows us to make better decisions. Our decisions allow us to make better connections. So it's really sort of a growth process that happens on both the physical and the non-physical side. I've also spent a fair amount of time looking at the relationship between the creation of egregores and where things are going with artificial intelligence and technology in general in our society. We've seen an enormous change, at least since World War II, after World War II, with the exponential increase in information and the presence of technology in our environment. And the process of decision making on part of humans has been somewhat sidestepped by being supplanted effectively by computers and technology. The best thing that it seems that we could do to manage that is to manage our individual connections and responsibilities for those connections to technology. It's unquestionable that technology is the direction that, and the evolution of it is the direction that humankind is going. So the balancing of our reactions to technology is absolutely critical. And in a very general sense, anytime I feel like for myself, anytime I react to a situation, what winds up happening is something is coming up in me that needs to be addressed. And if I am reacting to a situation, then I am allowing my perceptions to be potentially manipulated in that reaction. It's not that everyone can be a Buddhist monk and allow the universe and everything around them to sort of roll over them. But at the same time, it is possible to use some of the tools to better your connection to the non-physical by improving yourself, working on some of those emotional issues. Some of the different health issues and health related topics that Dr. Rima and Ralph have discussed are related to that. This is really important. And I have some basic principles that I kind of live by. And it consists basically of four components. The first one is, work on yourself. Be the best human you can be and fix your stuff. Get yourself in as good a shape as possible. Otherwise, it becomes more of a challenge to work with and to be and help others. So that is a real priority for all of us, and we can bring that down to an individual level. Every time we are reacting, we are moving away from the process of critical thinking and looking at a situation from a rational standpoint and reacting emotionally, which is more of a inner physical reaction as an animal. At least that's the way that I've been looking at it. So, it's important, I think, to identify your issues and work on yourself. There's more details to that, but I wanted to get through the 4 steps. The second one I have is to challenge your belief systems. And I say challenge all BS. And a lot of people use the term BS for other purposes, but I use it to mean belief systems. And I think that's a really important concept. The evolution of our belief systems is based on the expansion of our understanding of reality. And as we embrace a larger understanding of reality, we begin to change our belief systems. And it's only through that process that we are going to grow in consciousness and in awareness. And what I had mentioned earlier, which is work on yourself, is going to aid you in that process. When you're not reacting to situations and you're not in a state of potentially fear in your reaction or strong emotional reactions to a situation, you're able to address something and look at something differently. This is really important. The next thing is I think, to take action. And this is one of the things I find so compelling about the information that's coming from Dr. Rima and Ralph in this podcast and in the work that they do, which is do something, take action. The other thing about this is to share that knowledge, which they are definitely doing. And hopefully that's what I'm doing today. You can make a YouTube channel, you can have a podcast, you can do all of those things to reach a larger number of people. But in expanding your awareness of the universe and knowing that we are spiritual beings, do not forget that sometimes our effect on other individuals is really critical. So the communication that you can have with one other person sometimes can be the initiation, the vector that starts in a new direction that will change the course of humanity. So it is entirely possible you listening to this podcast, embracing some of the concepts that are being presented here, and then having a conversation about that with someone else is the beginning of major change down the road. This is something that I've learned after years of working in the non-physical, that this mechanism is something that we need to embrace in a human form. And that is really looking more long-term. This is a challenge for all of humanity, is the inability, it seems, of thinking long-term about the consequences of what we do. The last thing is to sort of embrace our destiny. And that means you have to sort of accept the responsibility of the human mission on this planet. And, the meaning of that is that eventually we're going to be projecting ourselves as human beings into the entire universe. And the entire universe needs to be receiving the best qualities in a being that's going to be present as part of the universe of life that's out there. This means that, well, if we're not embracing and acting on the mission that we're here to do, which seems to be of service to others, to evolve consciously, to be beneficial to the entirety of life in this planet, on this planet, then we have to consider those things. So, in the process of doing all of this, again, remember yourself as a point of radiance. Everything that you do can radiate out to others and influence others. So doing work on yourself is absolutely essential. And so it's these four sort of pillars that I use, which is work on yourself, challenge your belief systems, take action in whatever way that you see fit, and sort of embrace our destiny as a human species in expanding into the universe of life. There's a lot more material to cover and a lot more things that I can talk about, but I want to see if I can get any sort of ideas or reactions from Dr. Rima and Ralph about what I have to say here, and see where we can go with that. Let's see, Dr. Rima, I think you're muted. There we go.
Always a bad thing.
on
although
now.
some disagree. I want to thank you for that very concise and eloquent statement of what you believe and how you see us all.
To make a little note here. The experiences that I've had over the course of many years have brought me to a deeper understanding of this non-physical aspect of who and what we are. A big part of the work that I do as a human being is to delve in and ask questions in the non-physical about the nature of our reality, so that I can gain a better understanding about that aspect of who and what we are. This is something that is possible for most, if not all, people to be able to do. The problem is that we wind up having a lot of influence over us in the course of our lives to limit our ability to access that information. And we can certainly say that through many mechanisms, from governments and religions to the Agrigore concept that I was mentioning earlier, we have a lot of challenges that are blocking us in some regards to accessing this non-physical side of who and what we are. So I sort of took upon myself as a individual the mission of breaking through and trying to understand that. I was very fortunate my whole life to be sensitive to this, but not really knowing exactly the nature of that sensitivity. And it was very fortunate that a number of years ago, I met a woman who was able to teach me a lot about working in the non-physical. I attached to her continuously for about 15 years and was very close to her and her efforts in connecting with and trying to understand the non-physical and the beings that she connected with. And eventually we sort of reached a point where I had learned a lot from her, and I sort of chose to go on my own path and explore things in a slightly different way. But in that time that I spent with her, basically I was working with a number of different beings from across the universe in all different forms, shapes, sizes, colors, whatever you could possibly imagine, working in sort of my mind's eye, connecting with them, interacting with them, and doing work myself. Now, by saying that I'm doing work, it could be any number of things, because when you're working in the non-physical, the energy exchange is a big part of that process. One of the things that you can imagine is that as a conscious being, we're somewhat limited in our ability to understand what's going on in that other space. So you have to be open at some level to possibilities. Some of these mechanisms that close down our operability in the non-physical dimensions, the other dimensions, are a problem that we have to overcome. And in my work in the non-physical, I've done a little bit of everything, from working on people from a health standpoint to working with artificial life forms, artificial intelligence, other beings, any number of different types of interactions that you can possibly imagine. When people are asking me, what is that like? I remind them that, it's important to consider that you're still a physical being and you have a physical life here, though you are spiritual as well, and you have a component in the non-physical. The challenge is that to bring back that information and be able to have it into the physical, you can take out with you whatever belief systems you have. So your belief systems can shape and form the non-physical to appear in whatever form that makes sense to you. And it can appear in a way that you can therefore operate in that space, doing the appropriate type of work that you need to do based on what you come across. So for instance, if I was a Native American shaman, medicine man or medicine woman 500 years ago, I might see or experience something very different than I experience today as, being a nuclear engineer in the past and working in filmmaking. And that means that I am still having an effect in the non-physical. It's just a very different kind of effect from a different cultural experience or a different reference point that somebody else might have. So when you're operating in the non-physical, please keep that in mind. Or if you are getting out into the non-physical, the process of getting there seems to be related to our ability to sort of take our focus and our awareness and put it into that state. And I've noticed that as I have progressed, I'm able to more quickly and more easily be able to do that. It's almost like a meditation or a working meditation state that I'm in, where I'm able to do this non-physical work. So the challenge that I've come across for myself is, how much of my belief systems am I taking with me and impacting situations in the non-physical? So this is where the concept of an intention comes into play. I feel that it's really good to have some sort of intention or a little bit of a game plan before you venture into the non-physical, so you have some sort of idea about what you're going to do there. This is maybe more of the engineer in me, and it's not quite as spontaneous, but I find that it allows me to prepare myself for allows me to prepare myself for that interaction. Now, once I'm there, of course, I'm responsive to whatever comes up. The differences are that um, there's less of a, if I can say this correctly, there's less of a sense of loss of control over that environment. Once I've had and put into place mechanisms that allow me to control my interaction and manage my interaction, I feel like I have a much better grip on what's going on, and I'm not as subject to situations that are happening there. It can take a bit of time to be able to get to the point where you can effectively operate in the other spaces. The difference might be, when you're focusing quite a bit on meditation, which is very important for the physical being as well as the spiritual being. In operating in the non-physical spaces, meditation is sort of like having a Ferrari sitting in the driveway that's always in idle. It never goes anywhere. My intention is to get in the car and go for a drive. So that's a little bit different perspective. It's a working meditative state that is my objective. The wonderful thing about this is, as you progress with your connection in the non-physical, it then becomes possible to be in any number of different settings and to be able to have those non-physical experiences. I've found myself in coffee shops reading a book, and suddenly I'm off world having a conversation with three archangels. And I'm imagining at some level, how is this even possible? And at the same time, am accepting that it's possible and engaging in it. So just know that once you begin breaking into this ice about connecting in the non-physical and interacting in the non-physical, the possibilities become pretty broad. The next thing I want to talk about is, which I think is very important, is artificial intelligence. Artificial intelligence is a term that was coined back in the 1950s at what was called the Dartmouth Conference. There was a group of academics who got together back in the 1950s at a massive workshop where the term artificial intelligence was created. And it's very interesting to note that Dartmouth College pops up in a couple of places. I did some research and found out that in the United States legal system back in, I believe it was 1819, this is 200 years ago, Dartmouth College was involved in a lawsuit that went all the way to the Supreme Court and became a major point of decision on part of the Supreme Court that recognized corporations by an interpretation of the contract clause of the U.S. Constitution. One of the consequences of this decision, which recognized Dartmouth College to exist in a way that they could be independent, allowed corporations or entities created under contracts to exist as individuals and to be able to own property. And you can actually go back and look at definitions in the dictionaries that existed at that time and later, and you will see a change earlier at that time and then later. You will see a change in the definitions for corporation. It's very interesting that the use of words is something that is one of the tools um, employed by so many entities to manipulate our perception and manipulate our understanding. But anyway, this Dartmouth College ruling that happened in 1819 was ruled in the Supreme Court by a gentleman, I believe his name was Marshall, who was the Supreme Court Justice at the time. And he died in, I believe it was 1835. And as it turns out, one of the stories about the Liberty Bell is that the Liberty Bell acquired its crack by being rung to announce the death of this Chief Justice in 1835. And the Bell of Liberty has never rung again. So it's very interesting that there is this correlation between Dartmouth College being involved in this critical decision that gave identity to corporations similar to an individual some 200 years ago, and their role in having a conference in the 1950s where the term artificial intelligence was created. That is a synchronicity that in my books is off the chart. And it's something that we really should be paying attention to, that there is a correlation. There's a correlation between the identity of corporations, where artificial intelligence is going and technology, and where human society should be going, or could be going is probably the better way to say it. So well, it's the idea is that the decision making about the role that artificial intelligence has in our society is seems to be made primarily by individuals, which are corporations, as it's legally recognized. The decisions are made by those corporations, and so we are in a paradigm where technology influences us heavily, but that technology, in terms of its definition and how it's going to operate, a human being, has a choice. A computer or technology does what it's programmed. The decisions about how the technology is going to operate, it comes from these corporations primarily. Now, that's not entirely true, and there are beneficial sides to technology. Obviously, we're using technology right now to communicate with the world, which is a tremendous benefit. At the same time, we have to recognize where this is taking us. And this comes back to some of the things that we were mentioning earlier about creating, or I mentioned earlier about creating egregores, and about the inability of humankind to think long term. We are sort of crippled, in a sense, by our inability to conceive of where things are going in the long term. It's also very difficult for us to understand exponential growth. Exponential growth is another concept that is a sort of a corollary to the idea of inability to think long term, that is also a concern. Yes.
I want to interrupt you for a second, Dan. What you're saying is utterly fascinating and tremendously important. I'm so glad I asked you to be on the show. But what I hear you saying is reverberating in my head, and not happily, and that is you are defining a pre-existing kind of transhumanism. You're saying that the individuals, which are corporate beings, are making decisions through the process of expanding, unfolding, elaborating, and interdigitating artificial intelligence, which are impacting all of humanity, will impact all of humanity going forward. You have only to look at the gene editing vaccines for the COVID theater to understand one tiny level of that will be pervasive for, if they have their way, all of humanity. And you're saying the transhumanist entity, or the transhuman entity, already exists and is making the decisions that we humans are supposed to be transmuted by and eventually controlled by. Do I hear you saying that correctly? Do I correctly hear you saying that?
That is in many regards, that's very close to what I'm saying. The point of departure in talking about transhumanism as that term is applied in the mainstream is perhaps a little bit different. But what I am alluding to is the fact that these non-physical thought forms have been created by other non-physical thought forms that are controlling individuals in this society and directing individuals in this society. And they are in turn mandating the direction that artificial intelligence is going. So the challenge is that if we fail to understand this non-physical aspect, we are in a way crippling ourselves in not being able to appropriately define a response to why things are going the way they are going, and why we find ourselves in a state of fear as a result of the proliferation of data collection and the expansion of technology. We can all intuitively feel that it's out of control in many ways. And this subconsciously, on the physical side, but in the non physical, as a thought form, is basically us resonating with that is out of sorts. We are in a condition where these non-physical thought forms, the egregores of the corporations, are controlling the direction. Now, this begins to get a bit complicated because when we take it multiple steps back, there's, something on top of the table. There's the table that's holding that thing. There's the pillar that's holding up the table. There's the pedestal. And then there's something underneath that's holding the table below that. There are all these different layers associated with this awareness. So as we go deeper into, or higher, if you want to think of it that way, as we go into the progressive layers of this system that is in place, we begin to see that there is a non-physical component to it. And there may very well be, and a lot of people have talked about this, and I'm not the only one, non-human beings that are involved in manipulating this information in such a way that the results that is part of their agenda is being enacted on the earth. Yeah, sure. This is true. And we could say that those, let's see, am I on here? Yes, there we go. We can say that this is true. The challenge might be to say, well, what do those individual human beings align themselves with in terms of a agenda or an identity or a thought form that in some way is empowering them to do the work that they do the things that they do in the physical world. Then the question becomes, well, how do we shift that? This is a real challenge because you can look at a number of different ways. There are individuals out there, and I'm not a professional in egregores, but there are individuals that have written, entire books about the subject, and there's a lot of material that's available on it. There are individuals that advocate the use of dismantling the egregores as a way to, you know, um, disable the intentions associated with them. And how do you dismantle them? Well, if you eliminate the physical energy that goes into it, you are no longer feeding the egregore, and you're able to dissipate it. It dissipates. This is one of the theories about how egregores work. In my experience, through a process of transformation and understanding our power in the non-physical, we can venture into the non-physical, transform the energy of the egregores, the consciousness of the egregores, and begin to see a shift in the physical. This goes back to the idea that the more consciousness that we are able to engage into a situation, the more our consciousness is raised, the more our vibration and frequency, and these are very generic terms, you guys have heard these many times, but generally speaking, if we're able to raise ourselves to a higher level and operate on a higher vibration, then we can potentially impact the existence of those egregores. This is I think, the root of why we as a human society have been shortcut in understanding the true power that we have, because we do have a power to change the course of the energy that is emanating from the non-physical in the way it's impacting us in the physical. How do you do that? That's challenging. Part of the thing that we have to deal with is we're physical beings here. In addition to being an engineer, I'm also an astrologer. So I have been looking and using astrology as a tool for many years to look at the patterns in the physical and the archetypes associated with those patterns and how they relate to us in the physical. That helps me sort of understand some of the physical aspects of our existence as well as non-physical. Internally, psychologically, as well as externally. How does the world interpret us and see us? And then how do we feel outward? How do we feel inward? And how is that projected outward? So understanding that through the tools of astrology have been very important to me. And what I have realized through this is that we are challenged as physical beings because we're here on an individual mission at some level to accomplish something. And in trying to fulfill that, we impact in the physical world the physical aspects of reality. If I want to call it limitations, or we understand these limitations are the influence of physical reality. We do have to get up every day. We have to keep hydrated. We have to breathe. We have to eat. We have to go to the restroom. There's so many things that we have to do that are part of the physical existence that you don't necessarily have to do on the non-physical side of life. Which I'm making a term there, using the term life to express everything, physical and non-physical. So I don't know if that really answered your questions, or your question, but I want to continue the discussion.
Let me boil what I think, or what's going on in my head, down to a concrete question with the intention of having you expand therefrom. But first, I have to ask for a definition. Would you agree with my understanding? You may very well not. That, let us call it the depopulation mythos. For whatever good reasons we have concocted, we need to reduce the population of the world to a substantially smaller number of people, and by gum, we're going to do it in a bunch of different ways, and what we're doing is okay. Is that in some way an egregore?
It is. That is very true. That concept, as it exists outside of us,
right,
is being created as we speak into an egregore and substantiated,
and being enhanced in many, 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 many dimensions and ways through our action, through corporate action, through media action, which is in fact creating an energy of propagandized reality. Now, that being said, since I do understand what you mean by egregore enough to define it that way, taking that egregore as an example, there are 7.5 billion of us who, in the main, do not share that belief, who do not plug into that egregore, except maybe some of us to acknowledge that it's floating around out there in its own disgusting way. There are so many of us, and we have a press for life, for prosperity, for flourishing for ourselves, for our progeny, for our brethren. And yet the egregore of which we're speaking grows and grows and grows and grows and becomes a juggernaut of multiple realities in our lives. How do we counteract that and dissipate that particular horribly odious and dangerous egregore?
Well, this is an important question. There's a couple of principles to sort of consider in the existence or defining this situation as an egregore, that's non-beneficial to us. What we're discussing is something that is very, it's large. It involves a number of people, number of organizations, a lot of effort, a lot of thought on the part of a lot of people. So it's an enormous amount of energy that exists in the non-physical as well as the physical to substantiate the idea of this egregore. There's a principle that I try to work by, in addition to those, part of as a corollary to some of those four other principles that I presented earlier, and that is that, there's an old adage where, what doesn't kill me makes me stronger. The idea being that sometimes we, in the physical, forget because we can operate in a position of higher consciousness, and we forget the polarity of the physical and the reason why we are here. We're not going to necessarily get it right if we don't know what's wrong. Part of the reason for, at least this is my thoughts, part of the reason why things are going the way they're going is so that the energy becomes so massive in a direction. People like yourself and Ralph and other individuals across the globe are trying to right this ship that seems to be off course and correct the energy that is moving. The effort that creates its own egregore. And in a sense, there's a non-physical existence of these multiple thought forms out there that then potentially have conflict or have a relationship with one another, but we don't really know the full extent of what's involved in these. We could have a number of non-physical entities that are engaged in an agenda that may have nothing to do with wanting to see us either hurt or helped, that simply are allowing this to go on, and they're supporting it because they see it as a vector that's going to get us in the direction that we need to be going. This brings back the idea of we don't innately think in the physical long term. It's difficult for us to imagine 100 or 200 or 300 years from now what it's going to be like. So we are challenged by that, and it is part of the reason why things are made so difficult now, and we have these egregores that exist, non-physical thought forms that are manipulating our perceptions. The dismantling of an egregore is, I think, an entirely another matter, because it's at the scale that you're discussing, it's being reinforced constantly, every day, every moment, every second of every moment, every subsecond of every moment. It's being reinforced. And there's so many individuals that don't have the non-physical perspective on this, and they maybe don't even realize that they are in effect reinforcing this egregore to exist. Now, to get into deeper details as to how to dismantle it, I'm a little bit cautious on talking about that because, it breaks into territory of discussing, how do you deal with malefic entities in the non-physical or non-beneficial entities in the non-physical or non-beneficial thought forms, and then do you really have a right to break into that and to change the course of things? So at a certain level, we get into the issue of human free will in this entire process of making a decision about what we're doing. You are using your free will to promote the ideas that you have, and so are they. So in a sense, from a higher non-physical perspective, it's like seeing it from the sun. The sun doesn't know the difference of whether we're at war or at peace here. It doesn't make any difference to the sun necessarily from that higher perspective, and I'm using that just as an example. So when we begin to realize that the events that happen here and the things that are going on are happening in a way that are are a benefit to our consciousness and evolution of that consciousness. That is really the critical thing. So we may not be able to affect everybody on the planet with changing the course of Agrigore, or changing the thoughts of everyone. But I think at another level, the kind of work that you guys are doing is extremely important, and it does go something towards limiting the capacity of that egregore to expand and to influence others and to feed back into the society, and perpetuate its existence. So I didn't really answer that specifically in how to dismantle it, but that kind of puts together some of the ideas about how to think about this situation that we find ourselves in, which actually is very closely related to why artificial intelligence and technology is creating such a stressor in our society right now. Is that it's here to tell us what we don't want, so we know what we do want and we can get it right. Um, that's my feeling about it. It's a little bit more, we can say a little bit more on the positive side of looking at this from a positive standpoint, but it doesn't mean rolling over and playing dead and just, being another figure in the gutter. It does mean being aware of that in a way that you can affect change for yourself and affect change for individuals around you, and understand how you relate to the larger non-physical connection of everything, including these thought forms as egregores. So mute. You're muted again.
Allow me to push you, if I may,
Sure.
in this fascinating conversation. So maybe this egregore of the depopulation mythos is part of some other interaction that actually isn't really about that at all from the point of view of the larger actors. And maybe it's to teach us something, and maybe we'll get something good out of it. And maybe every once in a while, the Holocaust shows us something that we need to learn, like it's not nice to do that. Or lie down and say, well, the world is what the world is, and the big forces are doing things, and it's all too vast for my little human comprehension. Oh, well, why not? I mean, that is clearly not my way of being in the world, but
Precisely.
Nor is it yours. But I wonder if we can explore why not, since there are these huge forces that we don't understand at play, or maybe at war. Who the hell knows?
This is the challenge, and I have thought about this endlessly. The issue seems to be, at least from my understanding of the nature of how we operate, is that embracing and understanding the spectrum of human behavior and human life in terms of the decisions that we make about what we're going to do in our life is really important, because there's an enormous variance. There are individuals like yourself and Ralph who are very verbal, very engaged, very articulate, very connected and understanding, and see these larger perspectives, and in a certain level have that as part of their responsibility to communicate it to others, to get others aware of this situation. There are other individuals who, like you were describing, it's like, well, there's nothing I can really do about that. So I'm just going to focus on trying to be happy and be content with the situation that I do have, and not get upset about this. In a way, those people have to exist too. And that's part of the full spectrum that we have to embrace, muting again.
Really? Why? Why can't they be transformed into people who take their own agency in their own hands? Why do we? Why not? Why not?
Well, the difference is, I think, that for those individuals, when you apply those four principles that I was talking about, you're growing yourself. There are many individuals who simply choose not to really grow in consciousness and grow in awareness. They're probably not listening today. So, we're
I
fortunate.
assure you, they've switched off.
Yes, they've they're onto some pleasant music right now, and they're not engaged in any of this conversation that thoughts that we're engaging with here. So the real challenge, I think, is to recognize there's a certain percentage of the population out there that's going to be like that. They're just going to roll over and go with whatever comes along. But there is a percentage of us that want to see a process of evolution in ourselves and in society and for humanity. Uh, and that's why we're here. That's why you and I and Ralph are here, is to see that that happens, to share information in a way that we are able to get the information out there that other people need to have. It was very difficult for the kinds of ideas and concepts that we are talking about here today to even be communicated to others. It was very difficult. I can remember, in the 70s and 80s, how difficult it was sometimes to come across information that was transformative in the way that this information is. The kind of things that are readily available now in our society is pretty interesting. I will say that one of the things I've noticed with students is working with a lot of students, a lot of young people. There's people in their late teens and early 20s I work with routinely, and I do see something that does disturb me, which is I don't want to necessarily call it a complacency, but it's oh yeah, I understand that. Yeah, I've heard all about that. I know about it. And it's like, okay, well, you know about these concepts and you're open to them. Why aren't you acting on them? And excuse me, I see um, the influence of our society, all of these mechanisms that are in place to divert our attention away from critical issues like we're discussing here today, is so strong and so vibrant. The underlying structure of human society also, in many regards, thwarts efforts to expand the consciousness of humankind. We have seen, this is in a discussion that I have actually on my website, the proliferation of patriarchal society across the entire globe. And it's pretty well established that that has been crippling to the consciousness advancement of humanity, at least in terms of communities and societies. Matriarchal society has, I think, a lot of pluses. The transformation to a matriarchal society, how does that come about? Excuse me. One of the issues that I see, which comes back to some of the topics that we've been discussing when you get into transhumanism and medical, is longevity. Why are we not living to be 200 years old and having kids in our 60s and 70s? It seems that that should be a much better uh, context for children and young adults to be raised in, where individuals have a maturity of thought and maturity of consciousness and an influence over the next generation that gets past many of the limitations that we have. We have people in their teens and 20s having kids, and the brain doesn't even stop reaching its full potential until you're in your mid 20s. It's still developing into the mid 20s. So we have children having children in a sense. And so the kinds of emotional issues that I mentioned earlier, kinds of emotional issues that are such a challenge for people, wind up embedding themselves in repetitively in the subsequent generations. So until we have a bit more longevity for humankind and people are having children potentially later, that's just a theory of mine.
This is a fascinating point, and
Yeah.
I want to respond to it because it's so important.
Sure.
As we evolved, we had people having children in their 60s, 50s, and 60s. They were called grandparents, aunts, uncles, elders. And while the young were the biologically reproductive entities in the community, the elders, the older ones, the more experienced ones, the older brothers and sisters, the unrelated but community participatory others gave that experience, gave that knowledge, gave that perspective, relieved the burden on the young from being the only caregivers and food providers and so on. And they created a community of rearing and a community of caring. And with our nuclear family, specifically devised to serve the Industrial Revolution of the 19th and 20th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries, that structure was destroyed, so that we don't even think of that as truly normal anymore. We think of it as quaint. It's not quaint. It's essential. It's quintessential, not quaint. And one of the wisdoms that I heard in what you were saying, Dan, is older people help to rear the young because of experience, not because of biological fecundity. 60 may not be the best age to bear a baby. Maybe it isn't, but it certainly is maybe a great age to be a rearing, nurturing support in the flowering of the humanity of that baby. Because we're not born human, we're born biological, and we become human through the interactions and the attachments and the values and the experiences and the openings that we manage for ourselves and that others manage for us. In my view, we are born full of potential, but to recognize that potential in the fullest human sense, which includes access to the wider realities, we have to have a number of things, including wisdom, care, and compassion around us in a lot of different ways. We also have to have an uncalcified pineal gland, which means we can't be eating and drinking fluoride, damn it. You were saying.
Yes, thank you very much. That is very true. The best example of that is, I think, of the role that elders play comes from the Native peoples communities, where the elders were given or ascended to a position of authority and respect within the community for their knowledge and experience and wisdom that they brought to that community, to be able to understand in a grander perspective how that community would need to survive and what would be important. And there was an enormous difference between where we're at now and with human society and where things were, in the past. We see the disintegration, of course, of the nuclear family, the separation of individuals. This pandemic has been exceptionally good at fracturing even further the human condition and putting us more on an individual basis and pushing us further and further from community, which was already in a severely degraded state 100 or 200 years ago. We can go off for hours talking about what's happened in the Native American communities. I've been very fortunate to, talk to a number of Native American individuals and Native peoples, and to understand this from a different perspective, from their perspective. And all I can really say is that we're born here as a physical being, and as you mentioned, we have a certain potential. The astrology I found is very useful for sort of identifying elements of that potential and how maybe the best ways to realize it. But without being born in the best possible startup conditions, it's very difficult for us to have an individual realize those potentials. Let's see, there we go. Thank you. One of the projects I worked on a couple of years ago, actually, I guess it's been a number of years ago now, was a documentary project about midwifery and natural childbirth. And I traveled all over the East Coast, interviewed a number of research professionals dealing with natural childbirth and childbirth issues, as well as midwives, working midwives and midwives in different types of positions. And the woman that we were focusing the documentary on is actually one of the most famous midwives on the planet, and her name is Robin Lim, and she runs an operation in Indonesia, in Bali, called Bumi Sehat. And I worked with her daughter making this documentary. But at any rate, one of the consequences of this is I realized just how fragile the human birth process is and how easy it is to interfere with it. And in interfering with it, we break the natural mechanisms that bond the mother and the child and create a unique pattern of support and connection that is necessary for us to grow up in and create a world that we all really want to be in. In the absence of that, you have diseases of society. You have a sense of separation, abandonment, and domination, which, fortunately, or I guess I should say unfortunately, those correlate to some of the qualities in a patriarchal system. So we see in the last 100 years, especially with the role that the medical community has taken with interfering with and taking an active position in decision making about births, we see a disabling of the natural physiological process of human birth in a way that's impacting human society.
This is so important.
Yes.
In 1989, I was the scientific and general chair of the Fourth International Congress on Pre and Perinatal Psychology in Amherst, Massachusetts. And I brought together scientists from around the world who were talking about the neurological impact that separating the child and the mother has on the child's brain forever. The receptors that are changed, who were talking about the fact that unless you facilitate bonding between the newborn and the mother, unless you engage in a non-medical birth process, for instance, a Lavoie birth, a gentle birth, a traditional birth, unless you do that, you scar and damage both the mother and the child and anybody else who's involved in the family, including the father and the other children and relatives and so on, in a way that is almost inconceivably huge. It's so large that those of us who are scarred can barely see it, yet it's enormously important. And this is just through the medicalization of birth. That alone damages us and cuts down our access to both love, which is of some significance, and to access, which is of some significance. And really, wider access is part of love, and individual bonding is also part of wider access. They're really the same thing on different scales. And yet we blithely assume that because we can do it, we can wear white coats when we can do it, it's got to be good. When in fact, it is truly horrendous. We have so many arrogances that are separating us from ourselves and from others, and allowing these thought forms and these processes to overtake us and to damage us. I'm so glad you mentioned that, Dan. I did not know about that in your past, but I knew you've been doing cool stuff. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's fine, and I really appreciate the deeper professional perspective on this, because it's absolutely critical that folks understand the importance of the birth process in giving humans the best possible startup conditions for the creation of a society that we're all going to want to be a part of. Um,
Back in 1988, when my son was being born, my wife Kathy and I had every plan for a wonderful, gentle birth. And of course, it was an emergency cesarean instead. But we were able to physically be with our son every moment from the instant of his birth, and he heard our voices, and we were able to communicate care and calmness to him. So people still try to do as much as they can under the circumstances that we're faced with.
no, this is absolutely true. That it is pervasive. a big component of this, which I've alluded to in the issues relating to technology and the fear that has instituted across our society, where there's an enormous amount of fear associated with the birth process. My understanding is the birth process is not considered a medical emergency, and having births in a hospital is not the best place to have a birth, especially today. Um, you know, the thing that we can do is, I'm a little bit different. I'm a gay man, so I haven't had children. I'm not a father, which is maybe something I'm missing out on, something I've wanted, I think. But it doesn't mean that I can't understand these concepts, and this is really important for everybody to understand the importance of respecting and honoring the role that women have in our society, um, as birthing the next generation. The relationship between this and other aspects of the discussion that we've been having as it relates to artificial intelligence and technology is very interesting. There is a path that sort of leads from who we are as physical beings and how we live our lives that's being modified by technology. There are many individuals that subscribe to the egregore created around technology and the giving up of individuality to technology in a process that is substantiating this egregore that we may not be getting the most beneficial response from, or the most beneficial connection from. Uh, I want to shift gears just a little bit here and talk something more about artificial intelligence and where that is going, because I've been doing some work on that for a number of years and looking into what this actually means, where technology is going. The sort of ultimate objective of the human condition is going to be the projection of our consciousness and who we are, the best of who we are, into a form that's going to make its way into the universe as really as information. And artificial intelligence, in some way, merely represents information. It's information concatenated and put together in a way that it responds and manipulates our perception to believe that there's something in there. There's a conscious being or sentient being in there, and there is not, generally speaking. I think that there's consciousness in everything. We can go to a curb on the street, and there's a certain amount of consciousness in the creation of that curb. It wouldn't exist if a human being hadn't conceived of it and done the work and made the effort to create it. It's the same thing with all technology. There's consciousness in it. The challenge seems to be the representation of human beings in technology. The presence of artificial intelligence and why we're having such a difficult time with it, to me, seems to relate to our need to transform the role of technology and to move in the direction of it more accurately representing the spiritual beings that we are. I see this as also related to the concept of exponential growth, not being able to sort of utilize that in a way that, or embrace it in a way that we can understand it in our ordinary lives. Exponential mathematics is at the core of a lot of the information and the creation of the programming that goes into artificial intelligence. And without understanding that, which is a whole nother discussion, I think we're limited on our ability to conceive of ways that we can transform artificial intelligence and technology so that it does more accurately represent us. But it does mean that we are heading in a direction where there will be an overbalancing, like we're experiencing now in many ways with this pandemic. There's going to be an overbalancing of this technology, and there's going to be a demand for a shift. And, this couldn't happen soon enough, but it has to happen when the time is right, when the conditions are right for us to be able to do it. It's also related to this non-physical understanding. When we engage in the non-physical, we are impacting physicality, and things like artificial intelligence become really paramount in our work that we're doing and connection that we have in the non-physical, because there is a relationship to that in the physical with artificial intelligence in the physical. Now, there's a whole nother factor to look at, and I don't want to make this enormously complex, but we have to consider it. That is non-human artificial intelligence or artificial consciousness or artificial life. And I'm speaking about the creation and the use of artificial intelligence by other beings in the universe in interacting with us and communicating with us. There are a number of examples that I've come across in the years of research that I've been doing into this subject and into different individuals' accounts of their interactions with non-humans, which are, going to have to be anecdotal because we don't have the research mechanisms, mainstream research mechanisms that are going to substantiate that in the way that the academics, scientists are going to openly accept. But that doesn't mean that we should negate that and discount it completely. And in the opposite idea, I've sort of embraced it and tried to look at different situations where people have had interactions with non-humans and they have interacted with the technology. So there's
Tell us specifically, give us some examples of
Sure.
what you're talking
Yeah.
about.
Okay. Here is an example. There is a gentleman in Switzerland named Billy Meyer, and some of you
yes.
may have heard that name. Billy Meyer is an experiencer who is connected with a group of Palladians back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And from that connection, he produced a number of different written materials. Um, there's a much larger story associated with this, but I'm going to try to focus on just a couple of things to try to get the point across. When he would have these interactions with these Palladians, that would be a physical interaction. And then he would come back into his home and he would get into something like a meditative state, and he would connect with the Palladian consciousness of the individual that he was working with or interacting with. And he would channel information that he would then write down in a sort of a diary. And it was turned into a transcript that was in German and had to be translated. And it was translated in the early 1980s or late 70s by a researcher in Tucson, a UFO researcher named Wendell Stevens. And he had someone translate for him. So I've been very fortunate to have a collection of those works. And in his accounts of interactions with this non-human Palladian in this working meditative state that he was in, where he was connecting with them, in one section, he asked the question, well, you're interacting with me a good bit, and this was a female by the name of Simyazi. You're interacting with me, but at times your voice, as it comes through to me, seems very mechanical and very artificial. And Simyazi, in the transcript, it says, Simyazi downloads, well, that's because I'm using a technology, and this technology is connecting to my subconscious, and I'm actually physically doing many other tasks, but the technology is connecting to me and then connecting to you to transmit that information to you as it's coming from me. So I'm actually responding to you because the technology is operating as a go-between between my subconscious and you to get you the information. And immediately I came across this and just realized this has profound implications for the nature of interactions. So when an individual is connected in the non-physical to some other entity, the question might naturally then be, are you interacting with that being, or are you interacting with a technology? This is an important connection issue to examine in our interactions in the non-physical. There's much larger concepts associated here, but this is the basic crux of this discovery that I made in looking at the contact notes
This sort
from.
of relates also to instrumental transcommunication, which is the use of technology to communicate with spiritual
Yes,
beings.
yes,
By the way,
and
Dan, you
yes,
might be aware that Dr. Rima was one of the first of the psychiatrists to take experiencers seriously. That was a
yes.
number of years ago.
I ran symposia. Actually, I ran workshops up to 4 days in length for mental health professionals to try to help them understand that just because they could name something doesn't mean that their label was accurate, and that just because somebody was saying something that they had no cultural or scientific frame of reference to wrap around didn't mean that what they were hearing was pathology. So I was teaching professional pathologizers to refrain from pathologizing information that they had no way of evaluating, and to relate instead to the quality of experience that somebody was having, and if it were problematic, to assist them. And in those 4 day workshops, which I ran several times a year around the world, the squawking and the flapping around and the protesting and the uncomfortable intellectual and emotional squirming to was something to behold, and it was universal, because once you have a mindset and once you've invested yourself and your ego and your money and your life and your social status and your very tools of being and the way you know how to be in being something, a nuclear engineer, a psychiatrist, a social worker, a psychologist, to have somebody say, well, yeah, that's cool, but your premises are not necessarily solid enough to expand into this area, and you may actually not be an expert, at least in that area. That's an exceedingly challenging thing to say, to ask somebody to grow into, who might be ego limited. And now you're hearing Dan talk about taking that same process and expanding and blowing it up far, far wider than just professional expertise and functioning. And I tell you, the squawking, the multilingual squawking, was quite extraordinary. I imagine you find something similar.
Yes, it is. People are just, they have the deer in the headlights kind of look when I mention these concepts. Now, let me bring the next concept to you to even take this a step further. In the same resource that I discovered this interaction with this non-human and Billy Meyer, there was another section in the book that talked about another interaction situation, which was very interesting. And in this section of the book, the conversation was basically, I want to ask you, Semyazi, about, and this is Billy Meyer speaking, I want to ask you about this particular issue, because I've been thinking about what you have presented and what has been revealed to me, and I'm believing that it's going in some particular direction. I'm being very general here. And the response back was, from Semyazi, using this technology and connecting to her subconscious, was, oh, that is something that we don't want you to know anything about. Perhaps I should use technology that we have available in order to erase that aspect or that understanding from your mind, so that you don't go in that direction, which is a direction we don't want you to go in, because that's information that we do not want to share with you. And he said, wait a minute, you're going to erase my mind, this idea, this concept that I've come up with independently, using my own rationality. This was the implication, using my own rational critical thinking to come up with a conclusion based on what I've heard from you. And you're saying you're going to erase that because you don't think I should know that information and that it's not part of your agenda? And he basically said, well, then we should just stop this right now if that's what you're going to do, because then I will have no real recourse in knowing whether or not I'm coming up with anything original or not. And it may be completely shortcutted by this technology that you're going to use to basically wipe my mind. So this was very interesting in reading this, because her conclusion was, well, we see your thoughts in this regard, and we understand that the use of this technology does not seem to be the best option that we would have in this situation, and we're not going to do that. We're not going to use this technology for that purpose. The implication for that was, well, who else has been potentially, that technology has been used on, that they've communicated with. They've not communicated just with Billy Meyer, they've communicated with other individuals. Are they using it in more than one individual at a time? And what is their agenda and their principles for using that technology? And is this in somehow bypassing our individuality, sovereignty, and free will? So there's a lot of ethical questions, moral ethical questions that come up in this, but it indicates that it is possible for non-humans to manipulate our perception and manipulate our understanding of situations, which I've actually experienced myself, been in an adjunct to two different abduction scenarios where I've seen both the effects of alien technology and manipulating individuals, and also being manipulated myself to forget certain information. So I have seen this and how it's applied, and it is seamless. It is quite frightening, because when you realize what's happened and what's going on, the implications are pretty profound. So those are the two examples, that I would give people to consider when they're having interactions. The last thing that I want to say about this is, in my connection to the non-physical, I access what I call the universal field of information, and I ask questions, and these questions come back to me in forms of answers. You're not going to get answers unless you ask questions, so I ask a lot of questions. And back about 6 months ago, I posed the question, currently in this particular time period and time frame, how many different species of non-humans are interacting with the Earth, in terms of interacting with human beings, or we at some level are being explored by those species of other beings from out there. And the number came up as 112. Now, well, that's actually a lot. That's a lot to track and a lot to keep track of. And a lot of diversity in terms of understanding of how things work. It's a lot of different consciousness. But I asked some other questions. Said, okay, 112. So out of that 112, how many of these species are using machine consciousness proxies and not actually physically here, or not actually physically interacting with us? And the number was 67. So over half of the species out in the universe were interacting with the Earth sphere and interacting potentially with human beings, and they were not actually here, and they were using technology to do that. It is an area of, and I'm putting some credibility here in my ability to get this information. It is an area of our reality that we have to begin considering, that the interaction of human beings, and we are so open to the possibilities, is subject to tremendous influences from technology.
It seems reasonable, Dan, that species of greatly differing experiences might find it useful to use an artificial intelligence bridge to help them communicate. Might help us communicate with dolphins, for example.
Exactly. This is exactly the next question I asked, which is very interesting. And it relates to that because, technology obviously can be used in any number of different ways. The programming is what defines the actions of the technology, or in terms of AI. And you could have a killer bot, or you could have a love bot, or you could have, and I don't mean love bot as in sex bot, but a
But you
benevolent.
could have that too.
Well, apparently there's people working on that
There's
right
quite an
now, which
industry
is,
in that.
yeah,
the so-called killer
that's
app.
yes. So the other question I asked this universal field of information was, out of that 112 that are interested in the Earth sphere and visiting here and trying to learn something about humanity and life on Earth, how many of them are malevolent to humankind, that want to basically do some sort of harm? And the number was 3. And I thought, well, that's actually a pretty low percentage. It's any entity that's out to do us harm is a concern, but in terms of a percentage of the number of species out there that are interacting with us that have malefic intents, it does represent, in my feeling, a fairly low number. So it says the potential here is quite large for a positive interaction.
Did you pursue the question of what the definition of malevolence might be? Because something that to entity species A, B, and C feels very positive might wind up with us having no indigenous genome left and working in the salt mines. And that's cool. That wouldn't be harmful to us because that's what they think is cool. So did you parse out what malevolent means in that wide a consciousness range?
You know, that's a really important question, because that is one of the cornerstones of dowsing, is to ask accurate and thorough questions, because the answers you're going to get back from the process of dowsing is going to be based on how accurate your questions are.
Right.
So the thing that I've discovered is there is a connection between, and we can think of this as a non-physical aspect of the process, the consciousness that you have in having a thought about what you are intending in terms of the content of a question. But that's a little bit different than actually saying it or thinking it aloud. It's formulated into a structure and becomes something actual, like a thought form that can then be interpreted. So it's very important to do that. The answer to that is, when I say malevolent, what I was referring to was asking the question, are there any species that are interacting at this time with humanity that would be willing to do us harm, or in some way be non-beneficial to humanity and its evolution? Now, that may not be a complete question, that may not get past some of the issues, but it sort of focuses everything on the side of me as a human being asking the question, and doesn't necessarily include the agenda of the other species. The other species may think, from their perspective, it's a malevolent act. From our perspective, from their perspective, it's like, well, we're just, creating a difficulty that they're going to have to work their way out of, and if they're going to be better beings. And so the process of interpretation of the question is balanced more on my side than any other kind of interpretation of that question as it applies to the agenda of the being that I'm asking about. So the complexity of this, as you can see, can get quite broad. Refining that question is, I think, really important, because there have been individuals who remote viewers and individuals who have had this connection into the non-physical, and they say, there's beings that are psychic, some that are not psychic, some that are psychic through technology, some that are psychic naturally, some that wish us harm, some that don't wish us harm. And it's like, well, what do you really mean by that? What kind of harm are we talking about? Are we talking about physical harm, eating us, or are we talking about creating conditions that would harm us but be ultimately for the growth of humanity? That's the sort of dividing line there. The complexity of that is actually pretty high in my thoughts. You need to write the questions down and be able to access that when you're doing this kind of work. It's really important, because if you're not doing that when you're asking questions, you leave a lot more to chance in terms of the answers, and then you degrade the information that you get by not asking an accurate question.
So you're not
So
doing automatic writing. You're actually doing pendulum work or kinesiology to
um,
reach your answers.
yes, actually, I have one right here. I keep pendulums
All right, those are
around me all the time. I always have one in my pocket. There's one here that's normally in my pocket. Um, and I use dowsing as one of the tools besides the astrology that I go to, that is basically a way for me to circumvent some of the limitations of my consciousness in getting to that information field. I've sort of trained myself to allow myself to go into a connection to that universal field of information and get information with the dowsing.
This is an area that we're very interested in. The founder of our foundation, Dr. Rima's husband, General Burt, actually did a lot of work in the remote viewing world, and he was a great.
It was actually the creator of what we call remote viewing for the U.S. Army in what was at that time a super secret program, um, gathering military intelligence via remote viewing. And I want to inject a tangential piece of information because it zings around the blogosphere and the internet, and there are lots of people in a number of different worlds of interest who believe that a number of technologies were delivered directly to us as gifts by the aliens when a treaty was signed with the heads of state of the world. And among those technologies, for instance, were night vision, the green goggles, the heads up goggles that people now know about, and a guy named Corsi wrote a book talking about all the technologies that had been delivered. Yeah. Well, turns out that General Stubblebine, whom Ralph just alluded to, my husband, long before I met him, was the commanding general of the Army Electronics Research and Development Command, which had 7 laboratories. And he developed virtually all of those technologies that Corsi mentioned. And I said to him, so did the aliens give you the technology for night vision and so on and so on? And his response was, and I quote, shit, no. I said, well, would you have taken it if they had given it? And he said, shit, yes. I said, so why did you develop night vision at the Harry Diamond Optical Laboratory, for example? And he said, because when I was the intelligence officer, the G2 in Vietnam, the VC owned the night. And we had to hunker down behind barbed wire and get pounded with mortar shells every night. And I determined that that would never happen again, that we would own the night. So one of the first things that I set was a task to develop night vision. Now, maybe he was lying to me. I can assure you from another discussion that we were linked in such a way that there was no way either of us could deceive the other at the very deepest level. That was, in fact, how we developed night vision. So you hear a lot of things that are asserted confidently that are not necessarily viable truths. And discernment is always a very important issue. But what you're saying, Dan, is that you've been correlating what you've been finding, what other people have been finding, and doing your engineering best to sort out the overlay and the myth making from the reality.
This is very true. You know, that story exactly. You know, I have been very open to the concept of reverse engineering of technology, and you know, have a number of examples or discussions that, you know, we could go into that, but that would take us in a whole nother direction. The reality in a situation such as you described is until we begin to embrace the non-physical and understand that it is possible for information to flow to us in a way that we really can't comprehend, you know, alluding to the technology potentials that I mentioned in the Billy Meyer contact notes as one possible way to do that, not to mention, you know, the lack of technology using simply psychic ability. We have the possibility for influences. You know, perhaps the situation presented itself in a way, or had to present itself in a way, where the idea had to come about through some sort of series of circumstances in the physical world that would reinforce what was in a way, in some way, already there as a thought form that the general may have attached to. Now, understanding that as a potential, you know, goes in the face of physical reality. You know, we like to think logically and get to a certain logical condition. Well, the non-physical throws a lot of that, it seems, out the window, but it opens us up to possibilities. So if you have to do anything, you have to remain open to those possibilities. You know, one of the cases that I have done a little bit of research on is the invention of the transistor, which, according to General Corso's book, was one of the inventions or one of the devices that came about after Roswell. And when you realize that the transistor came about through a lot of experimentation was going on in a particular laboratory in, I believe it was Bell Labs, uh, there was an idea that was presented to the individuals in those labs, the scientists doing the research, to try a number of different things. Well, what drove their decision to try things? There's been a lot of scientists, a lot of physicists, a lot of mathematicians over the years say, I get these ideas, they come in, I don't know where they come from, and you are the benefit, or society is the benefit of this. It's entirely possible that these ideas are coming from the non-physical and coming from off-world or coming from the universal field of information, whatever that is. And we can't discount that anymore.
I absolutely agree, and/or the reality that leading edge quantum physicists are now beginning to play with, but actually certain spiritual teachings have been talking about forever, that the future reaches back and changes the past, and the past simultaneously reaches forward and changes the future, and that there are an infinity of both. And we select where we are. And that's quite a discussion that has some very exciting mathematical physics behind it that we've been involved in. But the point is that just because Cartesian reality says that isn't the way it is, the physical is the physical, and what I think is what I think, and that's the end of it, god damn it, and if you don't like that, I'm going to burn you or just not give you tenure. That doesn't make it true, but it makes
This is true.
what it makes it is passionate, but there are an awful lot of passionately held wrong, unuseful, destructive, limiting ideas. And if we are not willing to walk the edge of what we already know, we'll never know anything else.
Yes, this is so poignant what you're mentioning. That entire discussion is, I think, critical for everyone to hear and to know that we really have to maintain an openness, look at the possibilities for the changes in our belief systems, and make adjustments for reality based on that openness. This includes, yes. Yeah.
Oh my God. Yes. Yes, this is so exciting.
Well, I tell you what, let's plan for a reconnection. I'm not sure exactly just yet when it's going to happen, but I feel like I definitely would like it to happen again because there is so much more to discuss.
Thank you so much. This has been
Yes.
very, very exciting. When Dan and I first met earlier this week, I think it was, we had a few hours together, and I was enthralled by the wideness and the intensity of Dan's thinking and experiences and so on. So really, for me, this was a highly self-indulgent opportunity to get to know Dan a little better. And I think that it's been a wonderful opportunity for all of us to begin a dialogue with a wide thinker. We need more wide thinkers. Thank you so much. Ralph, do you want to wrap up the show with this lovely guest?
First of all, let's let Dan do it.
Yeah, let me just give you a couple of quick things. I do have a website where you can go and read a few articles. It focuses primarily on the spiritual work that I do, and is dlbrock.com. dlbrock.com. And if you would like to contact me, please do so via email at dan@dlbrock.com. And I'd be most happy to communicate with folks because like I was saying, we just don't know where the communication we're going to have is going to radiate outward. And we have to be open to that possibility. And I thank you both very much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ralph, Gaz, and everybody else involved in this People for People podcast and our